Hello, everyone. My name's Shima Baughman. I'm so excited to see you all for this panel. As we spoke about earlier in the initial session, we're living in a time marked by loneliness, division, distrust, and yet beneath this kind of cultural fatigue, there is this desire to understand what does help us to flourish. There's a quiet but growing recognition in this moment that we need more than just policy fixes or economic growth to truly flourish as people and as individuals and communities. We need meaning, we need belonging, we need a moral vision. And for millennia, religion has been one of those powerful forces offering exactly that. It's a question I've wrestled with in my own career in criminal justice and policy reform. For years, I focused exclusively on systems, sentencing structures, data models, statutory reform. And those things matter, of course. But over time, I began to notice that something was missing that's not to be found on a spreadsheet. And I know President Reese is now gone, but not to offend him with the statistician, but the most transformative work I saw wasn't happening within the systems. It was happening just outside of it, in church basements, in prison chapels, in visiting rooms where faith-based volunteers showed up week after week to love the people that were getting ready to re-enter society. I've seen this with a remarkable organization called Inside Out Network, which aims to pair every single person who's being released from prison with a church that they might be able to be mentored by and attend. Isn't that amazing? I've also seen it in volunteers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and also Jehovah's Witnesses, which are the number two top faith volunteering in Utah prisons, who show up, they preach, they teach, they serve, they read scriptures, and they build relationships with those in prisons. I also can't ignore the most effective drug rehabilitation programs I've encountered in my 15 years as a law professor are ones grounded in a higher power. Programs that really speak the language of forgiveness and humility and accountability and hope. All of these languages come from religion. This has been a humbling recognition, even for me as a deeply faithful person who's missed completely that that religion has been the thing that's been doing so much good in this world. And I think this conversation today feels very deeply meaningful to me, not just as a scholar, but someone who's still learning what it means to help people flourish. We're so fortunate to be joined by three extraordinary thinkers and experts who will bring different lenses to this question, which is, what does religion make possible in a society? And how can the protection of religious freedom allow these possibilities to grow? We'll begin first with Reverend Dr. David G. Latimore, who will draw from the rich legacy of the Black church, a tradition that has not only endured, but has inspired justice, community, and courage across generations. Then we'll hear from Dr. Matthew Lee, who will share groundbreaking research from the Harvard Baylor studies on flourishing, offering data-driven insights into religion's impact on well-being and communal life. And then finally, we'll hear from Shaylyn Romney, Garrett, a co-author of The Upswing, this award-winning book with Robert Putnam, and she will show us how actually looking backward into history at these impressive historical moments can show us the moral awakening that we need to have in this day and age. I hope this conversation will challenge, inspire all of us, perhaps most importantly, remind us of the civic and social benefits that religion can offer when it is allowed to flourish in freedom. Okay, we'll turn first to Reverend Doctor. Thank you.
I am so incredibly grateful for this opportunity to be here with each and every one of you. So thankful to the organizers of this conference, Dr. Clark, for your gracious invitation to join you here, to my esteemed panelists and our moderator for this afternoon, to my lunch partners, wherever you may be scattered throughout the crowd, for the invigorating conversation that we had. It was truly a delight. I want to be sensitive to our time here and consider it quite dangerous for you to let a Baptist preacher get up without a clear clock. Okay, I can see it back there. Amen. So I'm going to do the very best that I can, and I'm reminded of the words of my father, who often said, "Blessed are the brief, for they shall be invited back." So, with those thoughts in mind, it was positive to me to try to address the issue of the role of religion in human flourishing. And I'm certainly going to attempt to provide at least one possible explanation to that. I like many in the academy, I now have the privilege of serving out at Princeton Seminary, but I started my career off in investment management for a decade and a half. I then felt the call to church. I spent several years as a bivocational pastor, and then later about 15 years in full-time ministry before going to the seminary. And from that amalgamation of experiences, it really has shaped my understanding of my theology, of my faith, and the practical consequences of faith for living communities. I can say that I've had the blessed burden of standing with many families in times of tragedy. The loss of a child or a loved one, the rupture of a job, the destruction of a home as a result of a natural disaster. It has been, again, a privilege to be able to stand with humans in that moment and just through your presence to bear the burden of those dilemmas. But what has always struck me has been the reality that oftentimes when I later talk to them after the storm has passed, after the grief has taken on a different form, I've often had the privilege of asking them, so what exactly was it that got you through these difficult moments? How is it that you can lift your voice now in celebration after having gone through such tragedy? Because the reality is, anyone looking objectively at you would wonder whether or not you've lost your mind. What reason do you have to lift your voice in celebration or in just acknowledgement of the goodness of God in light of the tragedy that you've been through? And quite frankly, they're not alone. We've all had those moments. No matter where we are in life, no matter what we currently do, we've had those moments where life has hit us and knocked the wind out of us. And yet we were able to pull from a source greater than ourselves to celebrate the possibilities of life through divine presence. It is often our religion that has helped us to get to those moments. So I asked myself, how is it that they were able to respond? And oftentimes they would say to me, it was my faith or it was my religious community. And as was shared with us this morning, we've got a whole wealth of statistics to back up these notions that one's connection to a living religious community can be a source of strength and perseverance and resilience in life. But as I look at this particularly from the lens of the African American religion, I'm made all the more aware that the power of religion is not just a illusionary, transitionary moment in our life, but throughout the history of African Americans in America, after all of the challenges that they face, we see time and time and time again the power of religion to guide them safely through the darkest moments of life. In fact, if we go all the way back to the period of slavery, where African Americans had the tragic and yet uniquely powerful experience of gathering in clandestine meetings, hidden from the view of slave owners, able to gather as community and worship, we see then the earliest symbols of their thirst not only for religion, but also for religious expression and liberty at the individual and the physical level. They gathered in these small groups and they began to declare a theological imagination that was able to look beyond the realities of their physical condition and to envision a world that could be. And isn't that truly one of the distinctive powers of theological thought and engagement? It is the ability to lift our eyes above our current circumstances and to allow us not only the capacity to envision what might become or what could be, but the role that we can play in bringing forth that vision for not only our lives, but for those that follow behind us. It was in those quiet and often desolate moments that they shouted and prayed and sang into pots filled with water to diminish the volume of their voice, to keep themselves hidden from the overseer, and yet in those moments began to exhibit for us a long-standing tradition in African American religion, and that is the power that comes from our gathering when we articulate the presence of our God and our theological thought, no matter how simply we might declare it, and whether or not we use the fancy 12-syllable words that they teach us in seminary, but nonetheless express the depth and the strength of our understanding of God. And you could, from this point, just go and do a roll call of history of all the places where our religion provided us strength. When the promises of liberty that were extended to African Americans following the Civil War, and all of the aspirations that were expressed as a part of the Reconstruction period, when those ideas fell flat and the dreams of freedom went unresolved and unrealized, it was African American churches and communities that provided these communities the opportunity to say, well, what can we do for ourselves? And as we moved through that treacherous period of American history, it was our churches that built schools to educate our children. It was our churches that created cooperatives to allow us to work and to feed our families and our communities. It was our churches that included and created places of medical care for our citizens. It was our churches and our religious communities that allowed us to begin to even use the language of dignity to one another when the world around us refused to extend that courtesy to us. It was our faith that help us walk through these moments and to begin to envision a world that could be. Many of us go quickly to the civil rights period as another example of places where faith and flourishing walk hand in hand, because we so often understand the civil rights movement as the embodiment of religious liberty on its feet, where the ideas of religious liberty and religious expression met its fullest proclamation in the protest activity of this community, because there has been, concurrent with our thirst for freedom, a concurrently moving idea that is essential to our understanding of religious freedom, and that is religious freedom cannot exist in rhetoric or ideas alone, but must be made manifest in lived life. It's not enough to simply talk about ideas of religious freedom if they never touch the material existence of the people who are most vulnerable. This is one of the dividing lines that exist in our division today, because there is the deep concern that so often these conversations about religious freedom, while it focused on important issues of law and governance and policy, seem to minimize the consequences of our laws and ideas and policies on the lives of men and women of color throughout the U.S. And there is the hope that at some point we can do what has been a fundamental part of African American religion, and that is to marry the two, to realize that God is certainly interested in our soul, but he wants our bodies free as well. That God is interested in all of the theological depth of our faith, but God also is concerned about kids eating and people having a roof over their head and houses to lie in and jobs to go to and tables that have adequate nourishment. That men and women of color don't live in communities that are so ravaged by environmental discrimination that it is not surprising to those who have the data that there are cancer clusters in these communities, or that the kids suffer from particular diseases, not by accident or happenstance, but by deliberate acts of planning in city governments. We want a faith, and we believe in a faith. And I know that so many of us across racial lines hold to a faith that believe that God and our faith speaks to our intellect, speaks to our minds, speaks to our hearts, but also speaks to our hands and our feet, and invites us into this glorious work that God is performing in the human community. We've now reached a different point. And in today's moment, we find the challenges all the more plentiful all around us, whether it is dealing with the issues of sexual identity, whether it is dealing with the issues of economic disparity and opportunity, whether it is dealing with the plethora of issues that confront our schools. These are all places that challenge us in our understanding, and as a part of the African American Christian tradition, and I know that we are not alone in this, we turn to our faith for direction and help. And we do so at a time when participation in religious communities is dwindling. We do it at a time when the divisions seem more stark. We do it at a time when our conversations across communities are not as vibrant or as fruitful as they may have once been. But we also do it at a time when this particular condition provides us with the greatest opportunity that our faith has always been ready to address. This is the moment in which it is the strength of our faith that can guide us through conversations that can look across difference and to find a path forward. It is our faith that will allow us not to simply seek peace, but to work toward real peace, to not be comfortable with peace that again exists at a rhetoric level alone, but to look for genuine peace, which on occasion requires that we speak up when we see that there is injustice being performed. A peace that allows us to stand silently in the presence of evil is no peace and no Christianity at all. But Christianity calls us to the fight, to join hands across lines, and to lay our hands to the important work that lies before us. So within our tradition, we believe firmly in both the flourishing that comes as a result of our religious tradition and our faith, and we believe firmly in the pursuit of religious freedom. And there is great unanimity and great commonality between the various sectors of our community on these important issues. But at the core of the African American faith is the firm belief that our material and our faith existence walk hand in hand, and that God is interested in the totality of our life and is using God's presence in our life through our faith to inform the work that we do in all of these different environments. At the end of the day, as the songwriter often says, one glad morning, when this life is o'er, not only will we fly away, but our hope is to leave this place better than we found it upon our arrival. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that inspiring talk, and thanks to everyone who's played a role in making this conference happen. I know there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and so deep gratitude to everyone involved in this. I'm delighted to share a little bit about empirical research on religion and flourishing, and Harold shared a little bit on this topic earlier today. And of course, we can take a deep dive into any of those subspecialties that he mentioned, whether it's mental health or cardiac health or whatever. And all of that is really important in its own right, but how do we put it together? And so that's really the question for flourishing. So we're just going to kind of scratch the surface here today, but I'll share a few resources that if you want to dig a little bit more deeply into this topic, either are available or will be available. Most of this talk today is a preview of this, I don't know if I have a pointer, there we go, of this public-facing report from the first wave of the Global Flourishing Study called Complete Well-Being Throughout the World, Lessons from the First Wave of the Global Flourishing Study. So you'll see some of these tables and other images that are going into this report that I serve as the first author with Tyler Vanderweel and others as co-authors. So this is really the first attempt to summarize for a general audience what are the takeaways. We've got thousands and thousands of tables that we've published across. It's more than 34 articles now that have been published, probably close to 50, on the way to, I'm sure, 100 that will be published just on the first wave, just by the core research team. And then others around the world are publishing as well. So there's a lot of resources here. How do we distill some essential wisdom? And what role does religion play in that wisdom? We've got already books out, Measuring Well-Being with Oxford, that's an open access volume. You can download it without any cost. Understanding Flourishing, Developing a Global Community of Practice is out. That's available on Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion website, which is my primary appointment. And that really talks about the importance of taking survey research and other forms of research into communities and helping people put that into practice. And it's an invitation for everyone to join in that work. So there's plenty of opportunity to go around. Leadership for Flourishing is coming out in August, and Transcending Crisis by Attending to Care, Emotion, and Flourishing came out last year, I think. So these are all available for a deeper dive if any of this is of interest. As a starting point, how many of you have seen this movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, about the life of Fred Rogers? All right, quite a few of you, okay. It's not really that much of a spoiler alert, but there's an important scene in the middle of the movie where this disgruntled journalist is complaining to Fred Rogers, Fred played by Tom Hanks here, about how terrible his life is and unfair the world is, etc. And Fred Rogers stops him and says, "Will you take with me 1 minute to think of all the people who have loved you into being? 1 minute and I'll watch the time." This is kind of a turning point for this journalist. And so I'd like to invite us to do this today. I know it's right after lunch, it's nap time, might be helpful if we use our imaginations a little bit here. So rather than all the people who've loved you into being, let's think of one. So if it's comfortable, you can close your eyes. This is a way to block out distraction, but sometimes we don't like closing our eyes in public spaces. So leave them open if that's more comfortable. But just think for a moment about one person who has loved you into being. And I haven't told you what that phrase means, but it's sort of intuitive. One person who helped you to become a better person, helped you to persevere when you were getting stuck in some way. And call into your mind's eye an image of this person. And think about one thing that they did for you specifically to help love you more fully into being. And after you've had that moment to think about something specific, notice how you feel about your relationship with them and about what they've contributed to your life. And notice how you feel about that. And then know that if this person could be aware that you're taking this moment to just reflect on how they've loved you into being, that it would make them happy. Okay, that's a little bit more than a minute. Think about one word to describe your current emotional experience. What are you feeling having gone through that exercise? Think about one word. And then turn to your neighbor and share just that one word. It's very difficult. So don't hyphenate, don't play games with me. Just share one word about what you feel having gone through that gratitude exercise with a neighbor. Go ahead. And if you're on live stream, find a relative or a friend wherever you are. All right, so you're all very unruly students. You don't follow directions very well. I said one word. I was very clear. We've got a clock. Somebody's going to give me the 0, and then I'm done. So the point is that flourishing is not just about what we are doing, but how others are loving us into being and how we are invited to love them into being. So flourishing is fundamentally relational, and that separates it from some other constructs that we'll mention in a moment. The other point is that this is inherently energizing. We become more fully alive when we start to connect with the fact that people do love us more fully into being. They do contribute to our flourishing. And so we don't want to be limited by one word. I think it's really helpful to think about, what is our North Star? And for a lot of human history, subjective well-being for the in-group has been the focus. How do we feel happier? How do we acquire more material comfort, etc., at the expense of others. But like these lemmings, it doesn't take us in a very good place collectively. So one lemming says, I've really improved my subjective sense of well-being recently, and the other says, that's great. By the way, where do you think we're going today? So this is the invitation from the construct of flourishing to shift from partial, flourishing, which is subjective well-being, to the fullness of this integration or harmonization. So in the report, we say that happiness, wellness, well-being, and other aspects of the good life have long occupied a central place in popular debates and scholarly research. But flourishing is beginning to emerge as a way to integrate all of these discrete elements into a life well lived. So the point is that we're talking initially about integration and then eventually about harmonization. And that is really too complicated for any one individual or any one nation or society to do alone. We really require dialogue so that we can learn from others, so that others can love us more fully into being, and we can do likewise. Because our strengths often become our weaknesses. And so sometimes you don't perceive that until you've had a dialogue with different groups. Other terms, as I've given talks around the world on this topic, some groups say, well, that doesn't translate really well into our language. And so use something like fulfillment in plenitude. That's what they told me in Spain. Or the good life, or the deep life, or wholeness amidst adversity. In Japan, one of our friends in the Flourishing Network says, I like to think about this as the flavorful life, not pushing suffering away so we can escape into flourishing, but the integration. In the Japanese tea ceremony, you take a bitter taste and a sweet taste, and that complicated integration is much more enjoyable than just sugar all the time. And so flavorful life or complete well-being, any of these can be helpful. I will say that the field of flourishing is relatively new. Philosophically and theologically, it goes back thousands of years. But in terms of an integration of the humanities with social science research, it's relatively new. Not everyone agrees with the kinds of ways that I will define flourishing. But I think eventually communities are starting to move in the direction of this wholeness amidst adversity rather than separating suffering and flourishing. One of the things that flourishing attempts to do is to integrate a variety of well-being domains, from the physical, the emotional, cognitive, volitional, social, material, and spiritual, into a definition of flourishing. One way to define it is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, not perfect, but at least good, including the context in which that person lives. So what that means is that we're never fully flourishing because we have a loss of a loved one or loss of a job or something. We're always grieving a bit, so things might not always be good in all of these domains, but we're oriented towards integrating across domains rather than letting one domain come to dominate everything. And so in the Global Flourishing Study, one of the measures that we point to is the Secure Flourishing Index, which has meaning and purpose, mental and physical health, character and virtue, happiness and life satisfaction, close social relationships, and those are sort of ends in themselves. And then, as Harold was saying earlier, financial material stability as a means to pursue these ends more sustainably. So the Secure Flourishing Index is a core part of the Global Flourishing Study, but not the only measure of flourishing. So I don't want anyone to think that we're reducing flourishing just to these domains. There's other domains that are important. Creative expression, for example, is important. So the point is that these aspects of life are at least good, and that we include the context in which that person lives. And so all of the contexts are connected to all of the other contexts. So we never can say that we're on an island somewhere. We're always interconnected. And so in any season, we flourish more in some domains and dimensions and less in others. And resilience is distinct from flourishing. So coping and resilience and that kind of language is different than the delicious life, the life of integration. Dimensions for each domain can be framed at the individual, the group, the species level. So it's a lot to take in. This is a a picture of an area of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and very clearly a dividing line here between material flourishing and some deprivation materially. But flourishing involves integrating individual, organizational, communal, planetary, and spiritual dimensions of life-affirming forms of well-being in ways that promote well-doing. So if I were to ask on which side of the fence would you expect to find that more holistic flourishing being realized at a higher level, how many of you would say in the high rise with the private pool on the balcony? That's where I would expect to find it. Just a few. How many don't? I mean, because you don't know, but how many of you would say over here, more higher flourishing? More hands. And how many of you don't know? A fair number don't know. Generally, we would expect more flourishing on more domains over here. And so the way that we like to reframe the question is, are there variations by domain, material versus emotional versus social versus spiritual? Where are people most alienated from themselves, others, nature, and the sacred? And when do people feel fully alive and empowered to care for each other at work and in life? Or when do they feel like they're spiritually severed or like lifeless bodies in a system? And this phrase comes from a high school student named Carolyn Walworth, who was featured in an article in The Atlantic maybe 7 or so years ago. It representing students to the school board, I think at Palo Alto High School, which is a very well-funded, academically strong public high school, and basically saying we exist as students in this system of competitive insanity, and we feel like lifeless bodies in a system. And so you can see by the sort of countenance here what this, and you see a lot of young people sort of expressing this. So material affluence often is not driving flourishing in other domains. From the Global Flourishing Study, what I've done here, it's sort of hard to read, but you can see the Secure Flourishing Index, the top 10 countries in the Global Flourishing Study that have the highest scores on the Secure Flourishing Index, which I just mentioned, compared to the countries that have the highest GDP. And it's very different compared to the countries that have the highest scores on the Environmental Performance Index. How do countries contribute to the well-being and sustainability of the natural world? And so countries have different strengths, and sometimes the strengths can become weaknesses. One of the things that we're inviting is a joyful dialogue to share our strengths, learn about the strengths of others, so that we might love each other more fully into being as a species, as a collective, by harmonizing the domains and dimensions of flourishing. I'm sorry I can't look at the small screen there. My eyes aren't that good, so I have to look over here. The point is to harmonize through dialogue so that we can love. And so these are the top 5 on the Secure Flourishing Index in the Global Flourishing Study. And generally, it's the middle income countries that have the highest scores. But then you start looking at other things, other ways to measure it. A different measuring of flourishing gives you a different set of results. The Global Peace Index is something people really care about. It's a different set of results. Human Freedom Score, life evaluations, are you satisfied with your life? How often do you pray or meditate? For religious folks, this one's particularly important. How often do you show love and care? Again, GDP, which I mentioned earlier, and the Environmental Performance Index. So you can see some countries show up on multiple lists, and some kind of bounce around a little bit. There's a lot of variation here. How do we begin to harmonize across these things that human beings care about? And by the way, showing love and care, what does that mean? St. Thomas Aquinas defined love as to will the good of the other. What does Fred Rogers mean about people loving us more fully into being? It's to will our good. So how does religion, in the last couple minutes I have left, relate to flourishing? Current practice of religion and religion at age 12 influencing later in life. According to the Global Flourishing Study, in almost all of the countries, except Indonesia and Tanzania that we measured, religious service attendance has a strong positive effect on flourishing. And that doesn't mean religion's unimportant in a place like Indonesia. Of course, it's super important. It's just that religious service attendance is not more important than other aspects that we measured. So that's one sort of take home Both of those two countries that are not at the top of the list for religious service attendance do show up at the top for pray and meditate. Another finding is this is looking at religious service at age 12 and how that relates to flourishing today at the time the person took the survey. And religious service attendance at age 12 is one of the strongest predictors. 1 minute left to go. Harold alluded to some of this, so I'm going to skip over this one and skip over that and just get to this question. What kind of religion promotes flourishing? And this is not definitive. This is, I think, an opportunity for us to do some empirical work to answer this question. But in Miroslav Volf's book, Flourishing, Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World, he gives us a suggestion, and I think we could explore this empirically. He distinguishes between thick religion and thin religion. And he says that thick religion is going to promote flourishing because it curbs acquisitiveness and consumerism and generates contentment by calling people to place their desires and enjoyments into a larger spiritual frame and try to find joy and love of God and neighbor. And it also strengthens global solidarities by affirming the equal worth of all human beings and teaching that benevolence cannot stop at the boundary of one's own in-group, but must extend to all. And this is a theme that has come up a number of times in this conference. And then finally, contrasting that with thin religion, which may not contribute to flourishing in its broadest sense. This is religious movements that are identified with a political project and entangled with agents striving to realize that project and that become emptied of their moral vision. So I'm at a hard stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and what a great gathering. And I'm going to share some thoughts with you today that, in which you're going to hear echoes of what has already been said on this stage, both earlier today and just now. We've heard a lot about individual human flourishing. We've heard a lot about flourishing within certain groups. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit more and talk about societal flourishing, specifically within the context of the United States. And I'm going to draw my comments today from a book that I co-authored with the social scientist Robert Putnam. The name of the book is The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And I'm not going to show you the cover of the book here because there's a bit of a spoiler on the cover, so I want to keep you on the edge of your seats. The study of the upswing really started with a question about where we are today as a society. And so I want to just look quickly at a balance sheet as far as the state of flourishing in America today on the whole. Now, a lot of times when we talk about the flourishing of society, as Dr. Lee mentioned, we talk about prosperity, GDP, economic growth. And particularly in the American context, that's often what we look to first to assess whether we're flourishing as a society. And on the broad question of prosperity, we can debate how things have gone over the last 10 years. But if we're looking at the broad historical context, from the perspective of prosperity, things really have never been better. The average American enjoys more economic freedom and more economic prosperity than almost any other generation in history. But of course, this prosperity has come at a cost. And I'm just going to go through this quickly. First of all, that prosperity is not shared. We are living today through historic levels of economic inequality. There has rarely been a time in American history when the gap between rich and poor has been larger than it is today. But it's not just that we're struggling to flourish economically in terms of how we share our prosperity. We're also struggling to flourish politically. We are living through a moment of deep political polarization. Arguably, we have not been in a place, statistically speaking, more polarized than during with the possible exception of the Civil War. So it's not just our economics that we're struggling to flourish, it's also our politics. But it's not just our economics and our politics, it's also our society. We are living today through historic levels of loneliness, the dissolution of our communities, our bonds of affection, our traditional social structures, the places in which we gather are all falling apart to an extent that we've rarely seen before in American history. But it's not just our economics and our politics and our society, it's also our culture. We are experiencing today historic levels of cultural self-centeredness, cultural narcissism, a focus on the I, the view that society is one giant competition and it's every man for himself. So when we look at this balance sheet, it's hard to argue that we are in a state of societal flourishing. And this is a slightly more optimistic crowd than I'm used to speaking in front of. So I'm not sure how this next comment is going to land. But it is fairly common to look at this balance sheet and say, boy, this is a multifaceted, deep crisis, and it has never been this bad before. How are we going to get out of this? We've never been in a situation quite this ugly as a nation before. Raise your hand if you've ever sort of had that thought cross your mind. As I say, slightly more optimistic group than usual. Okay, but the reality is that that statement is not true. We have, in fact, by hard statistical measures, been in exactly the same position that we are in today once before in our nation's history, a state of deep lack of societal flourishing. And the period that I'm referring to is the last American Gilded Age. The historians place the Gilded Age roughly between the years of 1870 and about 1900. And this was a period on the heels of the Industrial Revolution when America was experiencing unprecedented prosperity and also unprecedented economic inequality, deeply tribal politics, gridlock in the public square, much like we see today. Also the dissolution of social structures and our social fabric coming unraveled, and a deep culture of narcissism. The culture at the time in this period was characterized by something called social Darwinism. In a slightly earlier period, Darwin had articulated his survival of the fittest idea as the way that the natural world was organized, and many social commentators said, hey, if that's how nature is organized as one giant competition, well then that's how society should be organized as well. Only the strong will survive, and the devil take the hindmost. So we've been here once before. But, and in that period of the Gilded Age, just as we see today, many social commentators and cultural critics and pundits were decrying the end of the American experiment, that we had descended into plutocracy and tyranny and oligarchy, and that the American experiment was going off the rails. But here we are today. The American experiment hasn't failed yet. And so that begs the question, what happened in that intervening century and a half between the Gilded Age and today? Clearly, those doomsday prophecies were never fulfilled. Those despairing anxieties were never realized. So what actually happened? So there are different ways to tackle this question, and here's one way to frame it. We can look at this statistically by looking at trends over time in these different areas of sort of societal flourishing that I've described for you. So the question that my co-author, Professor Putnam, and I posed is, since the last Gilded Age, has America been moving toward greater or lesser economic equality, greater or lesser compromise in the public square, greater or lesser social cohesion, and greater or lesser cultural solidarity? We can actually measure these things. And so we've looked at scores of different data sets, longitudinal data going back basically as far as we can find to answer these questions. And most of those data sets actually do go back to the Gilded Age. And there's a lot to say about this data. Each of the trend lines that I'm about to show you, you need to know, represents an amalgamation of scores of different data sets underneath each one of them. But because our time is very short, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of the answer to these questions. And this is what it looks like. What you're looking at here is a longitudinal study of trends over time in 4 different areas of our society: culture, our society, by which we mean social capital, politics, and economics. Each of these is represented by a different color. And you can see here what I was saying before about how we've been here once before, right? You can see where we are today, and these graphs aren't totally up to date, but we know that if we were to extend those lines into 2025, they would be plunged even deeper than what you see here. But can you see what I'm saying? that by hard statistical measures, this isn't just a historical argument, this is a statistical data-based argument, that we have been in a mess just as difficult as the one that we are living in today, and we got out of it once before, which means that there's hope that we can do it again. So there are lots of different things that we can learn from these graphs, and I wish I had all the time in the world to go over that with you. Many of you might be looking at just the sheer breathtaking correlation. For those of you who are not statisticians in the room, I am actually not a statistician, I'm a storyteller. That's the role that I play on the Bob Putnam, Shaylyn, Garrett team. But for any of you who are not statisticians, I'll just flag for you the fact that it is extraordinarily rare to find this many disparate trends tracking the exact same trajectory over such a long period of time. This is a breathtaking finding that you're looking at here. Because what it indicates is that each of these different parts of our society were not actually moving according to their own logics. They were actually moving as one. And the way that Professor Putnam and I describe this phenomenon is that we're looking at a graph, a statistically validated summary of America's I, we, I century. We started off in the Gilded Age in a very I-focused mode that manifested itself in all different aspects of our society. We slowly pulled ourselves up and out of that and moved our society more in the direction of we. And then something flipped in the 1960s, and we tumbled right back down that same curve. I'm sure many of you are wondering about what happened in the 1960s that precipitated the downturn. There's an entire chapter in the book on that. I'm not going to address that today because I think for our purposes, it's much more relevant to ask the question, in a period of American history that looked so similar to the one that we're living through today, what did our predecessors do to pull us up and out of it? Because if we can learn what they did, maybe we could have some hope of replicating it and getting ourselves back into another upswing today. So this is a primarily statistical story that I've told you so far. It's a data-based story. And so our first question ought to be, is there anything in the data that tells us what prompted the last upswing? And it turns out that there is. I want to go back to that question of prosperity for a moment, because we have this sort of bias in American society, largely driven by the social sciences, that we tend to think of people as economic animals, driven by economic incentives. And so we're a social scientist, and I'm sure there are many in the room to look at these graphs. You might think, well, if I had to guess what the leading variable in this story was, I would guess it would be economics. That's in fact what my colleague, Professor Putnam, thought when he first charted this data. What's so fascinating here is that it turns out that economics is not the leading variable, and not only is it not the leading variable, it is the lagging variable. It is the thing that started moving in the right direction last. So if it wasn't a story of us getting our economics to be a more equal place, and then we all started to feel like we were in it together, and it changed our culture, that is not the story here. In fact, the story is quite the opposite. The leading variable in the story of America's upswing was culture. Before we got our economics back in a more equal place, before we started cooperating in the public square and in our politics, we had a cultural and moral revolution in which we changed the values that we agreed upon as a society were the animating values of our culture. And the part of this story that I want to focus on for the purposes of this gathering is actually some of the very first voices leading this moral awakening. And these were voices that came from people of faith. As you might imagine, and based on looking at these graphs, this deep hyper-individualism of the Gilded Age affected every aspect of our society, including religion. Christianity of the day was very focused on my personal salvation, my relationship to God, that's my business, and your personal salvation is your business. It was a very individualistic version of Christianity. And into that space stepped a bold new generation of preachers who came onto the scene and started something called the social gospel movement. And this was a movement that said, now wait a minute, Christ's message was not just about salvation for the one, it was about a blueprint for a more just society. And these social gospel preachers started to articulate a new vision for American society that was not a giant competition, but a giant collaboration in which the goal was to take care of the most vulnerable. And it wasn't just Protestant Christian preachers who were putting this message into the world. Actually, the Rerum Novarum, which was a Catholic papal encyclical, was published in the 1890s, and it is looked at as the source or the sort of starting point for the Catholic social justice movement. It was very clear about how immoral a society that was so disparate in terms of economic equality, how immoral that really was. And here's an interesting example from this period. Have you ever wondered where the phrase, "what would Jesus do," actually originated? It was originally published and popularized in a novel that was a best-selling novel in the 1890s in America. It was written by an evangelical pastor who was calling America to repentance for the vast economic inequality of the day. Here's another example. This is Washington Gladden, a member of this social gospel movement. He said this. I think this is one of the most articulate distillations of the view of the social gospel movement. He said, "It is idle to imagine that changes in our governmental machinery or in our organization of industries will bring us peace. The trouble lies deeper. What we've got to have if we want true democracy is a different kind of men and women. Men and women to whom duties are more than rights and service dearer than privilege." This was a complete flipping on its head of social Darwinism and a using of faith and sacred text to say, we've gotten our society all wrong. We are not flourishing because we are not a we. We are not taking care of one another. Ultimately, these moral leaders were the tip of the spear in terms of bringing about what historians call the progressive era. And this was not small p progressivism, the way we use the word today. Small p progressivism describes the leftmost end of the political spectrum. The progressive era was capital P progressivism. Okay, this was a movement that was so diverse as to be barely coherent. And historians have called it largely a movement of self-reflection, of sort of chastening, moral chastening directed inward, in which we as Americans began to question our own values, our own motives, and then organize our economics and our society according to that different set of values. The progressive era was vast. It involved not only moral leaders, but truth tellers and visionaries and gatherers and organizers and joiners and civic innovators. And religion was not only an important part of this story in terms of changing the cultural values of the period, but also in reorienting and inventing new ways of bringing people together. The Upswing witnessed the biggest boom in social capital and new ways of associating that we've ever seen in American history. And many of those new ways of bringing people together happened in places of faith. Places of worship became not so much places where I could just go and commune with God on a one-on-one basis, but places where we could feed the hungry, places where we could gather the lonely and the oppressed and the downtrodden, places where immigrants who were new to this country could be gathered and fed. And that all was the role that religion played in shifting the narrative that ultimately drove this upswing that rippled out into all different aspects of our society. So it's not just a nice sentiment to think that religion can help us flourish personally or can help certain groups of our society find hope in moments of being downtrodden. It's also true in the data that we can move our entire society in the direction of flourishing if we can reorient our values. And no one is better placed to do this than religious leaders, and not just religious leaders, but religious practitioners as well. And so I just want to leave you with this quote from Teddy Roosevelt to really summarize what we learn from the upswing. He said this: "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. We can achieve individual flourishing. But if we don't achieve flourishing for all, the data from the upswing shows that everything begins to unravel." And so I hope this helps us just to put into perspective the power that we hold as cultural influencers to begin to change the narrative in America that just might move everything in a more promising direction. Thank you.
Thank you to our distinguished, articulate, inspiring panelists. I was going to ask them all the same question, a very quick one. And then if you can be thinking of any questions you might want to ask, we still have a little time for you to ask questions as well. So for all our panelists, we've talked a lot about history and told really neat stories and shared awesome data. But if you were to share with the people in this room and those that are going to watch this on live stream, just one thing that they could do in their lives to increase religious and human flourishing, what would that one thing be? And then if we can start with our Dr. Reverend.
That's a great question and a very difficult one. It was similar to one that was asked of me at lunch. What would I do to change things? And I guess the simplest answer that I can come up with is very tied to the comments of both of our colleagues. And that is to find a place to bring to life your faith for the benefit of someone outside of your immediate community. So to find that other and to figure out what form can my faith take that it might be made real in the life of the other, might be the offering
Beautiful.
I would give.
Thank you. Dr. Lee?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I guess I would add to that a shift from monologue to dialogue. So much of what we do in our world, in our families, in our communities, stage on the stage, universities, et cetera, is really monologue. And so how do we begin to invite a kind of dialogue that would help us love each other more fully into being?
So good.
Yeah, and I'll just build off of both of those excellent comments to say, go and meet your neighbors. Don't be a part of the majority of Americans who do not know the name of their own neighbors. I mean, and there's a wonderful poem by David White called Start Close In. Whenever we want to create a big change, we have to start right where we are. And some of that is in doing the heart work and the internal work to have a desire to connect across difference. But some of that is just connecting with the people who are right in front of us.
Yeah.
Rather than thinking about these, for as much as I think and write about big societal trends, those trends only shift when we start right here.
So beautiful. Imagine if all of us went and met the neighbors we didn't know. That's huge impact just right here. I love that. Okay, do we have a first question? I think there's mics that can go around. Any brave people want to ask their question? Yes, we have one here. Zach Davis has a question.
Thank you all. Wonderful research and presentation. Shaylyn, the I, we, I trend is fascinating. I think we all feel we're too I focused. And I try to imagine what those preachers were like and what the audience was like at the turn of the century when we shifted back to we. And I'm imagining the social infrastructure and technological environment that we're in now, trying to picture, with a media environment that is motivated by hostility and outrage, how do you create embodied experiences that can really help us experience the we-ness that we need to? And are you seeing any signs of hope that the we is starting back on a new upswing?
Yeah. Embodied experiences. I mean, I think that's so important, right? Because this goes along with your comment about monologue versus dialogue. And it's also getting out of theory and into practice, right? And faith communities are so good at this. I think that one thing that I've failed to recognize, and I'm going to echo some of your comments, I've grown up in the LDS faith. And I've also, for 20 odd years, been an expert about social capital. And for anybody that knows about social capital, LDS communities in Utah in particular top the charts every single time, every way that you measure social capital. The Mormons are doing it better than anybody else. And I've had that lived experience. In fact, I credit that with why I was interested in studying with Professor Putnam to begin with, is because I lived something that he was saying was in decline in America. And that was a puzzle to me. But I've never really given myself permission to speak more broadly about the social technologies that Mormonism and LDS communities possess that actually bring people into relationship, and largely unlike people. I mean, I think it's easy to look at somewhat homogenous religious communities and say, oh, that's insular. But in my experience, for example, geographically bounded worship communities where we're not shopping between different places to go and worship, we're assigned to one. And the people who are in it, those are the people you're going to connect with and serve, whether they're like you or not, whether you like them or not. I've lived that phenomenon my whole life, and yet I've never spoken publicly about the power that has to put us in spaces of true connection. And so I'm finding my courage to connect these worlds of the academic, what the data is saying about these things, and what my embodied experience has been as a religious person. And I know this is true of Judaism. This is true of many Protestant congregations. I mean, this is true across the board in terms of religious, particularly in the Black church, right? We have so much knowledge about how to do mutual aid and care. And I'm sensing in the world, and to get to your question, Zach, about signs of hope, I am sensing in the world a shift, and I think President Reese described this a little bit. In the past, religious communities have been a little bit dismissed, and I think even academics are beginning to recognize that we've tried a whole bunch of stuff, and those graphs just keep going down. And yet religion knows something, and maybe it's time for us to learn. And one of the things that religion knows is how to do care and mutual aid.
Wow. Do you have anything to say on that question?
Yeah, I would just add one of the reasons we see that GDP is negatively and statistically significantly related to the Secure Flourishing Index is that in the middle income countries, they have those higher levels of social capital and they're better at caring. And they also tend to have higher levels of religious participation than others. And in some of the lower income countries, there's so many other problems that they also have the care, but they have the other problems. So I wouldn't say the middle income countries are the sweet spot of where we want to be, because most people in high income countries don't say, let's cut our GDP in half or something. Nobody's saying that. But what can we learn through dialogue about what is really essential to flourishing? And at the same time, how do we pursue economic development and growth in ways that don't compromise that?
I think they've covered this well. One of the questions that comes to mind, though, is if religious institutions have these embodied or embedded practices that will help, to what degree have they too become impacted by the culture in which they're situated?
Sure.
And it's diminishing some of the lessons or effectiveness of the tools that they might be able to share with the rest of the world.
That's such a great point, because as I pointed out with the Gilded Age, religion is not immune to the broader phenomenon of hyper-individualism. We tend to think, that's over there, that's secular society, but that is not true at all. And so I think that self-reflection is super important. Absolutely.
I love that. And it really goes back to your prescription earlier, is we need to talk to the other. So if religion is just talking to itself, that's not the solution, right? We need to be talking more broadly. So thank you to all our panelists. I learned a lot. I'm sure you all did too. Let's give them another hand.